Everyone. So just want to introduce you guys to the ProMAX team. We're going to be talking to you guys about how to search for hardware and software for your video team, a couple things to consider, and how to fit it into your workflow. Joining me today, I'm Matt Mister, is the ProMAX team. We have Mike Dang, Nathaniel Cooper, Ryan Reisdorf, and Taylor Hodgetts. So guys, let's just kind of dive into this. So what are the most important software and hardware components when you're building out a workflow for your video team? So whether that's workstations, storage, what are some of the big things you need to consider when building something out?
Workstations and storage, no, I mean, obviously it's gonna change wildly depending on your work group's requirements, right? Like, can you work separately? Do you have to work from like a shared environment? Those are all decisions that you kind of have to make ahead of time as you start looking for this stuff. And once you've made those decisions, then it's just a factor of scale, right? So again, do you need a high-end network switch? Can you go direct connect to a shared storage server? Do you need a shared storage server? It really comes down to scale. And most of the video teams that we see kind of, you guys correct me where I'm wrong, but it seems like they kind of organically self-write to, somewhere in that 3 to 8 user range. For the most part, when it comes to producers and editors, there's bigger ones, that are out there that certainly are on the edge, but usually that tends to be where the creative work is done in those kind of mid-sized groups. So,
largest I see typically goes up to like 15 or so, and that's not too irregular, but it still is on the smaller side usually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of it kind of rolls downhill from what kind of cameras are you shooting on, because that largely determines what you need on the workstation side, what you need on the storage side. So I think cameras make a big difference, but then you also have to look at, Brian, like you were saying, how you guys are going to work as a team, because there's so much production that happens kind of from the whole like Predator standpoint of just one person that's doing everything end to end, and that legitimately needs different workstate or different technology considerations than when you're slicing up different parts of the project for different people.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's dive into some of those considerations. Like, how does that change what you should be looking for? What technologies are more important to someone taking that Predator approach versus the slicing it up with the team?
Let's not all talk at once.
Well, I mean, one of the big things is going to be your NLE. Like, if you're working in a work group, whether you're using Avid or Premiere or, Final Cut versus Resolve, it's going to make a huge difference in your requirements and what systems are going to be used with those different NLEs. If you're going to be doing, bin locking, working in the same project simultaneously. I'd be worried there for a second.
Out.
All good.
Let's set that part in.
Yeah.
So what was the question, Matt?
So the question was so we talked about the Predator approach versus slicing it out among the team. How does that impact what you should be, like, the decisions you're going to be making for hardware and software? So Taylor kind of went down the NLE route. So what should you be considering with that? Like, what's going to determine which NLE that you should be looking for based on that approach?
I mean, I think NLE is just personal preference. Like, every NLE can really work with pretty much any kind of footage these days, as long as you have the hardware behind it, which is, what we're talking about. But I think, if you're looking at like, one person doing everything end to end by themselves, like, generally that can work just as well in a shared environment versus a local storage environment. But when you have people moving different parts of the project, that is when it generally does push you into a much higher need or a much higher benefit for shared storage. I've seen a lot of people work collaboratively without shared storage, it's just a lot clunkier. It forces you into these times where it's like you literally just have to wait for one person to do something before you can do what you need to.
Yeah, I think, NLE choice, to Nathaniel's point, it's personal preference. There's one exception to that, though, is that's in a larger environment where, specifically, I'm basically talking about Avid here. When you've got a large environment that's already Avid and that's already, using bin locking and various things like that, you're just not going to escape that, and you're going to get sucked in to that ecosystem. But in general, especially from a Predator perspective, if you're a one-man band or you're, kind of the point person for a particular project, chances are you're going to be in 4 or 5 different programs. You're going to be in the Adobe suite. You're going to be, on the move, because you're basically OS agnostic at that point. You can have your MacBook, you can have your fancy Windows laptop. It doesn't even matter. And everybody's going to be sharing the same experience at that point, which is a pretty valuable thing. The only other one that really factors in these days, I mean, you've got Final Cut X out there still, that the Mac users are still, there's a few diehards that are still rocking that, and, more power to them. But other than that, Resolve is starting to come up there. Frankly, the price is right for Resolve. It's free.
Everybody loves free.
It's free, and it's free up to an interesting point. Like, you can do certain effects, or certain numbers of effects, for free, and then you hit this wall. But frankly, most people aren't going to do that number of effects before they hit it. I know a lot of people that use it quite successfully. And then, if you're doing real color work or anything on high-end stuff, or maybe not high-end truly, but heavy stuff like 4K, 5K plus kind of stuff, Resolve tends to handle that a little bit better than everything else right now, and it's just the color tool for most, short of a $1 million room in, a Color 3 or something, you're in good shape.
Okay. Mike, since you do a lot of editing in Resolve, right? So how would you?
Yeah, just switched over recently.
Okay, so how would you compare that to some of the other ones you've used?
By far, it's very, very advanced for what it is. Yeah, because Adobe feels clunky to me now, and in all honesty, Resolve's very smooth and very easy to work with.
Okay, cool. So like earlier we mentioned, like Nathaniel mentioned, what camera you're using is one of those big things that can play into your hardware decisions. We talked about your NLE can maybe sometimes have an effect on that. So are there any other things outside of the cameras you're bringing in that can really impact what hardware you need in your editing workflow? Or is that one of the big ones to really focus on?
Mostly your file format and what you're expecting to export later down the line, if you want to play around with 4K or just 1080 60, 1080 120, all that stuff.
Okay. You want to dig a little bit more into how your choice can kind of impact the results you get, the performance you get?
Mostly the hardware aspect than anything. But I edit on a laptop, so I can pretty much do 1080 easily. 4K is a little skeptical.
Okay, so for people who are looking to push into the 4K, 1080, like anything beyond like standard HD, what are the big hardware considerations that they need to make? Like what do they need to make sure they have in there to get the performance they need?
Generally CPU more than anything, I feel, versus like a GPU. Especially if, let's say, you're on Premiere, you want to be more CPU intensive than anything.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, that's once you get into 4K plus, that's when you start to have to play the balance between storage bandwidth and CPU bandwidth. Like on Mike's laptop, if you've got a highly compressed 4K video, the CPU might tap out. But if you've got a not highly compressed codec, the CPU might be fine, but now you're at a gigabyte a minute or more, for your storage. So you can only store a handful of files on the laptop without external storage or connected storage. So yeah, you get into that balance. Like if you're looking at a real 4K plus workflow, you're probably talking a desktop with a dual dual processor CPU, something that you can really, really crank up from a codec perspective. Because, we're just talking about decoding it just to play it in real time. Once you start adding effects and color and all that other fun stuff, that's just that much more that the CPU has to do, and then you're outside of real time pretty fast.
How true is that with heavily compressed 4K? Because I shoot 20 megabit per second 4K on my phone, and that's just a MP4 file.
It's less of a concern for certain formats, because the really common ones that are in our world today, like H.264 and HEVC now, Intel chips, the consumer Intel chips come with hardware decoders. So you're not, for lack of a better way to phrase it, you're really not hitting the CPU in a traditional way to decode that stuff at high frame rate, or not high frame rate, but high resolution. It's going through kind of its own little dedicated workflow. And there is still some CPU consideration there for sure, but it's a lot less than a more generic codec. Or you take something like R3D, like the red codec, which is highly compressed in its own special way, and without special processing, like a red rocket or something like that, it will wreck your CPU. And I mean, frankly, by design, that's once you've got a dedicated piece of hardware to do that, it takes a lot of the edge off. So yeah, H.264 and HEVC in particular, like all of our phones are shooting H.264 and HEVC at this point. So
okay. So you had mentioned that there's a balance that you need to maintain between your storage and your CPU. Is there a standard formula to doing that, or is that like a case by case basis based on what you have?
It's case by case. I mean, it starts with the camera, right? Like, it depends what you're bringing to the party. If you're bringing 4K highly compressed, then you're probably not using a lot of disk bandwidth because it's nice and small, but you're going to be using a lot more CPU potentially, and maybe GPU depending on the codec as far as how it's getting decompressed. And like I said before, just immediate, or the opposite of that is true. If you have codec that's very heavy, chances are it's a lot less work on the CPU, but you're going to have to pass a lot more bandwidth across the disk to read it properly. So yeah, it's totally a balance. All the cameras have kind of their own built-in hardware encoders and decoders, and some work better than others. For the most part, though, like I said before, H.264, HEVC. You get into AVC Intra is a big one, is probably one of the most popular ones right now as an intra-frame codec, to kind of find a balance there. But yeah, it depends on your needs. It depends on what you're shooting with, and frankly, what you're going to deliver at, because that's going to define what you're shooting with eventually.
I think one of the things that's generally true, nothing's 100% true with any of this stuff, but one of the things I find is generally true is, as weird as this sounds, workstations are backwards compatible with old cameras, but new cameras are not backwards compatible with old workstations. So if you have something new in the mix, if it's a camera on an old workstation, you'll probably have issues. If it's a new workstation with an old camera, you'll probably be okay.
That's generally true. Yeah, I mean, nothing's going to probably stop you from working on it. It's just not going to be quite as pleasant as it could be.
Yeah.
Okay. So some other stuff that when people are considering looking into this stuff, obviously cost is going to be one thing, and performance. So where are there some pieces that you should absolutely go all in on getting the highest quality hardware or software, and where are some spots where you can afford for a lower end product to kind of so you can spend more in other areas? Like, what are those cost and performance considerations when someone's going to purchase this kind of stuff?
Hands down, first thing, no questions asked, is if you're looking at a workstation, your primary OS drive should be an M2 SSD. Those things, they are inexpensive, and they'll push 2,000 megabytes a second, which is more than a lot of high-end shared storage pushed a few years ago. and you're not going to get much data on it. But from a workflow perspective, from running your programs on it and everything, I mean, it's more responsive than even what SSDs did to hard drives, 5-6 years ago or more. Yeah, absolutely, hands down, no question. That's the first thing that you need on everything if you're in production. Luckily, these days, in the last couple of years, you'd be hard pressed to find a laptop that will do production level work that doesn't have one built in, and most desktops at this point will as well. But yeah, no question on that.
To me, a lot of it's also about balance. I mean, there are very few workflows that are 100% consistent 100% of the time. So, do you need a GPU? Probably at some point you will. Some things utilize it, some things don't, but you probably will need it at some point. Where I see people getting into hot water is when, cameras are always the fun, cool, exciting thing. Workstations and storage is a lot less exciting. Where I see, people getting into hot water is when you've got, you overspend on a camera and then underspend on a workstation. Like if you're using a really, really, really high-end camera, you need a really high-end everything else, including GPU and disk storage or SSDs. It just kind of, everything needs to match more than be the best or the worst.
Yeah, I know of more than a few companies that bought nice high-end 4K plus cameras and then end up having to spring for like a Key Pro or something to convert it into ProRes in real time, and then they just work on the ProRes, then rather than their nice fancy codec that they had. There's some benefits to that too, but the main one is you're just that way you can work on it on your laptop.
Okay. So it sounds like the camera you're using is kind of what's going to dictate a lot of your decisions further down the workflow, or
well, yes, assuming that you're working with one camera. A lot of facilities, like, you don't have a choice. It comes in from whoever you hired to film, or from social media, or from any number of sources. So, basing it off the camera could also be a mistake depending on your workflow. So there's no easy answer to this. I say it in every workflow training that I do with our clients. Like, I've probably done up close to 500 of them at this point, and I can't say that there's ever been two that have been identical from a workflow perspective. It's all over the board, and everyone's a little bit different, has different needs. And to Nathaniel's point, like, balance is important, because the chances of your workflow changing within the lifetime of the workstation that you're building today is absolutely 100%. Like, there's zero question it's going to happen unless you throw that workstation out next week. So you've got to build it in a way where you've got a reasonable amount of future proofing in there, even though that's a really difficult concept to do with PCs and builds and stuff. It's something you gotta consider.
Okay, so I know you said there's no two that are the same, but how would you recommend going about trying to future-proof yourself in that situation? Like, what's like the high-level stuff you can do ahead of time, so you don't have to go buy a new workstation every year or two, because
how many zeros can I put on that blank check? Because you can build something that's going to last for, legitimately will probably work in production for 5 years if you spend the money to do it. If you are looking, probably the real sweet spot for a production level PC, like Windows type PC machine, is probably around $2,500. You can build a really, really good system that will easily last you, 3 years or more, with components that you can cycle out. Like, if you're going to put a new video card in 2 years from now, you keep that thing alive for another, 3 or 4 years. The flip side of that is
motherboard and processor. You can get the best motherboard and processor you can within your budget, so that you can upgrade that workstation and keep it going.
Yep, exactly.
Definitely the key there.
Yeah, you get a good i7 or i9 processor with as many cores as you can, or there's a lot of AMD options that are becoming very, very viable now. And you get a solid video card. If you know you're going to be doing video card heavy stuff, you can certainly, dump a little bit more into the video card side, because you can burn a lot of money there very quick buying the high end. But if you get a mid-range, high-end kind of card, 2500, you'll have plenty of RAM, you'll have plenty of CPU, you'll be able to put a couple of really good fast hard drives in there and probably have some Thunderbolt storage on top of everything, and that would be a solid machine. You go, on the Mac side, frankly, you're hard pressed to do anything for $2,500. But if you're willing to spend more money on the Mac side, traditionally they've had well-built hardware. Obviously the last couple of generations of the Mac Pro had some upgradability concerns. Hopefully they're resolving that with the new system that's supposedly going to drop very soon now. Yeah, that remains to be seen. But there's certainly no one ever. It goes back to nobody ever got fired for buying their production department Mac Pros. Like, that's just it. It works. You can make it work. If you had to, you could load Windows on those Mac Pros if you really need to do it. Like, that's just the way it works. You got options. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but it's just comes down to how much you can afford to do it with.
Okay. And then here's a question to kind of close this out. So we've talked a lot about like how your hardware and software decisions can improve your workflow, make it better. What should someone completely avoid? Like, what will totally tank that?
It's not really a hardware decision, but it could be on the camera side. But if your deliverable doesn't require you to shoot in 6K or 8K or whatever, don't shoot in 6K or 8K or whatever, because you're just like wildly complicating your workflow. Not everything has to be shot on a crazy ass Red Dragon or whatever the latest and greatest is over there. Even Mike here is our in-house Apple aficionado and has his iPhone 11 Pro, and some of the videos that he took, we were trying to play for review, and they were so high resolution and so high quality we couldn't play them in real time for review on the system that we were reviewing them on. Like, absolutely. And they're gonna go on like YouTube. That's cool, but no one's gonna see Mike in 4K on YouTube. But yeah, and then his file sizes are like 4 times what ours are, the rest of us. So that's just it's a randomly good example of just consider your deliverable. Don't make life hard. Like, not everything's gonna eventually get repurposed and thrown on the big screen when you become a famous director someday. So
perfect. Anyone else got anything to throw in?
Yeah, I'd say, on the storage side, obviously we're a storage company, but I would say I've seen a lot of people, overspend on capacity and underspend on performance. It's really easy to go for that 12, 16 terabyte drive and then not worry if it's a SATA, 6G SATA drive, that kind of thing. But those generally speaking, I've seen a lot of people just dump a lot of storage onto disks and then stick them on the shelf just to have a mess that they're not really acknowledging or dealing with. I do think I love SSD for a lot of reasons, but I think SSD actually makes you a lot more cognizant of cleaning up media as you're going, which I think is actually really important.
Why do you think it makes you more cognizant of that?
Because you have less space to work with. You have to. But yeah, I mean, that's when you have a 16 terabyte hard drive and you fill it up and you can get another 16 terabyte hard drive pretty inexpensively, it's pretty easy to just unplug that, stick it on the shelf, and then be like, yeah, I'll remember what files are there. I'll remember that. But when you do actually go SSD, performance becomes a different thing. It's much more capable performance-wise, but then it does force you to kind of think about, I don't want to go out and buy another SSD. Those are expensive, and I have less space to work with, which does force you to think about your deliverable and say things like, maybe I shouldn't shoot on 8K RAW when I know this is going on somebody's YouTube page in HD.
Mike and Taylor, anything from you guys?
I was going to say the same thing. I've seen people spend a lot of money on a shared storage system and then their workstations can't decode the footage they're trying to read. The server's doing absolutely nothing. It's not even working hard. Their workstations are, throttling the CPU because it's overheating just trying to play something back in Premiere. And it's really easy to do that where you don't take into account your footage, you don't take into account the specs of the workstation side. You're concerned that the server's not performing up to spec, and you take a look and the server's not even working because it doesn't need to.
Yeah, when all the work is on the CPU at that point. Yeah.
Anything from you, Mike?
Very much the same thing. People buy the lower end machines and just can't handle it here and there. But on the other opposite side of the spectrum, people buy all the crazy workstations and go little space as possible, try to balance it out.
Yeah, I think so much of it for me, so much of it comes back to balance in your workflow, from the camera to the workstation to the storage to the deliverable. Just having that balance is where things work well.
And to that end, like, if you're in the process of setting that kind of thing up, like, consulting with somebody that has been through those things before is endlessly useful, because then you can, avoid buying a giant workstation or a giant laptop that is way more expensive than you truly need. If the deliverable is the same and the quality is the same and you can do it in a better, faster, cheaper way, then hey man, that's a better business. That's the way to do it.